Okay, hey, we're going to look at the Cold War outside of Asia this time in the 1960s. And really what we're going to focus on is the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration. Um, there we go. So here we go. We have both John Kennedy and Mikhail Khrushchev, Khrushchev, um, who takes over after the death of Stalin for the Soviet Union, and their struggle for global um, hegemony. Yeah, we're back to that hegemony, right? Kennedy's elected the 35th president of the United States. He takes office in January of 1916, or I'm sorry, 1961. I'm just a little bit dyslexic. 1961. And the election issues, the things that are going to pop up really right off the bat for Kennedy is number one, the Soviets beat America into space with a satellite called Sputnik. And if you're from Kansas, you can actually go to the Hutchinson Cosmosphere, and you can see the backup satellite from Sputnik. It would have been, I guess, Sputnik 2 or whatever they would have called it, although they do launch something called Sputnik 2, but like Sputnik's backup. And it's there on display. I don't think you're supposed to touch it, but you can if you want to. They had the U-2 incident where the United States develops these spy planes that fly over top of the Soviet Union and take pictures. And while we're doing that, we think that maybe they don't know that we're there, but eventually the Soviets shoot down one of our spy planes. And we have to admit that, hey, we've been spying on you. This happens right before Kennedy takes office. And then another problem facing Kennedy when he takes office is the small island nation of Cuba, which is just off the coast of Florida, 90 miles off the coast of Key West. In Florida, had undergone a revolution in which a dictator is replaced by another dictator, and Fidel Castro takes control of the country and basically turns that country towards communism. And so he aligns Cuba with the Soviets, and it creates a problem for Kennedy as he comes into office, right? The election in 1960 is this first televised debate. It's kind of interesting because Kennedy, you can kind of see here, Kennedy's this good-looking, tan, makeup-wearing politician, and he runs against Richard Nixon, who's vice president at this time, and Nixon's pale, and the TV audience really is drawn to Kennedy, and they look at Nixon as losing the debate, but the radio audience basically believes that 50% of them believe that Nixon won, and so the reason I bring this up is like Kennedy's going to go through some problems with the Soviet Union, in which the Soviets kind of look at Kennedy as kind of a pretty boy or somebody that's maybe not as politically astute as he needs to be for his position. And so they tried to intimidate him using different methods, and it's not successful. Kennedy's new policy with dealing with the Cold War is still going to be containment, but it comes up with this idea of a flexible response in which it's going to respond to aggression that should be measured and appropriate, versus Eisenhower, who was president before Kennedy, argued for this idea of brinkmanship, where it was all or nothing. We're going to, you just use nuclear weapons if the Soviets get out of line. And so it's a shift away from this nuclear focus to more of a traditional military, although during Kennedy, we do see the development of the special forces, the Green Berets, Navy SEALs, those types of people. One of the movements of the Americans during the 1960s is the development of soft power, in addition to capitalism and military power. And soft power just might be things like the Peace Corps, in which volunteers are going to undertake humanitarian projects around the world. In developing countries, we're going to create the Agency for International Development that's going to distribute aid, and have this Alliance for Progress, which is promoting economic growth into Latin American countries to diminish the appeal of communism. Okay, but the thing that probably defines the Kennedy administration more than anything, is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis comes about because of various different failures in foreign powers, right? On January 3rd, 1961, just 7 days before Kennedy takes office, Eisenhower cuts off political relations with Cuba and Fidel Castro because of Castro's alignment with the communist nation of Russia. Castro had led a successful takeover or revolution of that island and displaced the long time dictator that was very pro United States during that time frame. All right. And so Castro breaks up oil fields that are owned by the United States and the British, and he gives them to some of his buddies and some of the Cuban people. He broke up commercial farming and redistributes the land to the peasants. And some of this land is owned by U.S. sugar companies, and so it leads to a U.S. sugar embargo on U.S. sugar. It also leads to this embargo on Cuban tobacco. And so when Kennedy takes office, there was already plans in the works to replace Castro. And so when Castro takes power in Cuba, about 10% of the Cubans flee to the United States, and these are going to be the upper class Cubans. These are going to be people that are in very high positions. And Batista was the former dictator in Cuba, and they come to the United States. And so Eisenhower listens to some of their concerns, and basically the people are like, look, if you just give us some money, we could overthrow this new guy, and we could restore order to Cuba or a democracy or whatever. And so Eisenhower gives the CIA permission to start to train Cuban exiles about this. And so Kennedy comes into office, and he has reservations maybe about this plan, but ultimately agrees to continue it. And so on April 17th, there's 1,500 Cubans that try to invade Cuba off the southern coast of Cuba. America's really bright about it. We take the refugees and send them to the southern side, and it just fails. The airstrike that the CIA basically carries out against Cuba fails to take out the Cuban force. The commando unit that was supposed to the commando unit of CIA agents that was supposed to come in on the northern coast fails to land on the island. They get swept out to sea, and the Cuban government hears of the attack. And so there's, I don't know, 1,500 Cuban refugees that show up, and there's 25,000 Cuban troops, and it just looks bad. All those guys get either killed or imprisoned. And Kennedy goes on record as saying that the United States looks like fools to our friends and rascals to our enemies, and just incompetent to everybody else, right? And so there we go. We have the fascist capitalist dog of John Kennedy as the political cartoon. And so Kennedy does something way different. He takes the blame. He says, hey, you know what, it was my call. And he goes on national television and basically accepts responsibility for his poor decisions. And the United States pays like, I don't know, $53 million in food and aid to exchange for these prisoners. And the Soviets see this as the act of a weak leader. And so they start to step up efforts to try to build Soviet influence throughout the world. And Kennedy at this time, he's kind of a playboy. He sleeps. Obviously, he's married. He has a young family, but he sleeps around. He's kind of a womanizer. He has affairs with movie stars that are kind of known publicly, and so the Soviets see this guy as kind of this pretty boy that comes on TV and he's like, oh, makes mistakes and whatever, and so like we can kind of push him around. And so they start to strengthen their hold on different areas. The first thing that they're going to do is they're going to construct a wall around West Berlin. 3.5 million Germans escaped communism through West Berlin. They go to East Berlin, into West Berlin, and then out of West Berlin into Western Germany, and then Western Europe. And so in August of 1961, the construction of the wall begins. It's unannounced. They just lay down a bunch of barbed wire fences. And so this wall becomes a symbol of division between the East and the West, and it prevents the free flow of people and ideas from East and West. And West Berlin is completely enclosed by this wall that comes around it. Checkpoints are put in place for cars or buses or anybody coming in or out of West Berlin, and guard towers and death strips and anti-vehicle trenches are built, and there's a lot of effort put into keeping people in East Germany, and from going to West Germany, Eastern Berlin, to West Berlin, and then Western Germany. In the Eastern German government, it's called the Anti-Fascist Protective Wall. To everybody else, it's the Berlin Wall, and the wall just prevents this mass immigration and defection from east to west. Over the course of the wall, like the life of the wall, about 5,000 people tried to escape, and 200 people are killed. With this construction of the wall, it divides this family, and it can divide a family if part of the family's in Eastern Europe or Eastern Germany, and part of the family lives in Western Germany. They're no longer able to see each other. And so from 1961 until the 1990s, Berlin is going to be separated. Okay, and so given the invasion of the failure of the Bay of Pigs, Castro basically asked the Soviets for help, and the Americans had put medium range nuclear weapons into Turkey, and the Soviets were very upset about this, and so they decided that they're going to send nuclear weapons into Cuba, to prevent the United States from doing anything about to trying to overthrow Castro again. And so in October of 1961, the Soviets send over nuclear weapons, and then the Americans find out about it on October 14th. And so Kennedy and the Russians are in negotiations to remove those missiles, and we're kind of in the situation where the administration doesn't necessarily know what to do. And so the Air Force and the CIA basically urge Kennedy to attack Cuba before the missiles are up and operational. Kennedy is dismayed with the misinformation that the CIA and the establishment and the government had given him during the Bay of Pigs operation. And so he works with his brother, Robert Kennedy, who is his attorney general, and the Soviet ambassador, to create some kind of a back channel compromise in which the Americans promise that they're not going to invade or overthrow Castro in Cuba, and the Soviets would remove missiles from Cuba. In exchange for, in 6 months, the Americans would also remove missiles from Cuba. Or I'm sorry, remove their short-range missiles from Turkey. And so that's that compromise that leads to the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, for about a 2-week period, the world was really on edge, to the point that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kremlin and the White House have a direct phone line put in, so the two leaders of the two most powerful countries in the world can communicate. Okay. Kennedy is going to see an elevation in activity, communist activity in Vietnam. Vietnam was once a colony of France. It was called French Indochina. And in 1954, the French forces are defeated by the communists. Communists are led by a guy by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who was an American ally during World War II. The agreement is in 1956, the nation's divided in two. The North is going to go to the communists, the South is going to go to the capitalists. And in 1956, there's going to be a free and fair election to determine the future of Vietnam. However, their leader, Diem Diem, canceled the election and named himself president of the Republic of South Vietnam, most likely because he realized that the nation was going to go towards communism. And so Ho Chi Minh begins efforts to overthrow the government in the South. And the United States is going to support the South with money and training, much like we would do with anybody else, through ideas like the Truman Doctrine, right? And so that's going to happen, I don't know, throughout 1956, 1957, 1958. And Kennedy's going to see the escalation of American involvement during that time frame, but never commit wholeheartedly to American military intervention in Southeast Asia. Of course, in November of 1963, President Kennedy is shot and killed in Dallas, Texas, and Lyndon Johnson takes over as president, commander in chief. And so Lyndon Johnson inherits this situation in which capitalism is the government in charge, or the preferred economic system of South Vietnam. But they have a very unpopular and corrupt government versus North Vietnam, which is a communist government. Yet they're supported by not only the Russians and the Chinese, but also the people of Vietnam. And so the American foreign policy makers during this time frame come up with this idea called the domino theory, in which they believe that if one nation in Asia falls, it's probably going to lead to the next. And then they're going to topple, all the nations in Asia are going to topple over to communism, much like a row of dominoes. And so we've seen China fall. We've seen an uprising in Korea. Now we have Vietnam, and then Laos and Cambodia, and so forth and so on. And India would be the ultimate prize. And you can't allow India to fall, because all of a sudden you have the world's largest land-based nation in Russia as a communist nation, and the world's largest population-based nation in China as a nation. And if India goes, then, like, I don't know, 2/3 of the world's population is going to be under communist rule. And so that's unthinkable to the United States and unacceptable under the terms of this idea of containment. Okay, so DMDM, his government is very, very corrupt. He's not a very good leader. And somewhere in I think it was shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy, DMDM and his brother are killed in basically by a military coup in Vietnam that may or may not have been supported by the Central Intelligence Agency. So the Americans support South Vietnam with advisors and money. However, throughout time, it's very apparent that the generals in South Vietnam, or at least the army in South Vietnam, are not necessarily all that interested in fighting a war with the North. The Battle of Apok it is one of these examples, and it's kind of one of the turning points in the war. It's in January of 1962, in which the American forces with the South Vietnamese finally lure the North into a major battle. But the South, even with the advantages of American technology and American leadership, the South refuses to engage in the battle, which could have swung the tide of the war towards the South. And so American advisors began to want to leave the war during that time, and that's that was kind of the position I believe that Kennedy was heading into into the 1960s. But with his assassination and with the change in leadership with Dien Dien, Lyndon Johnson is going to take control of the war. And in August of 1964, we're going to have a United States gunboat that's fired upon off the coast of Vietnam. And this is referred to as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which the Americans have a ship that's fired on, possibly by the North Vietnamese army. And Congress gives Lyndon Johnson basically a blank check to fight this war against communism. And so Johnson's going to spend a ton of money and send a ton of American troops to Vietnam to fight this war. Ho Chi Minh is going to develop a communist, kind of a terrorist group called the Viet Cong, that's going to work in the South and live in the South and attack American troops, and the ARVN, which is the South Vietnamese Army. And so you're going to have the Viet Cong, which is the guys in the black pajamas that are going to be fighting the Vietnam, or the American troops, as well as the North Vietnamese Army that you're not going to see too often. And it's a different type of warfare. It's it's a war that doesn't have clear battlegrounds. There's not clear rules of engagement. The Viet Cong, well, it's a war of insurgency or a people's war, in which the Americans are trying to force their way of life onto a people that don't necessarily want to accept that. The Americans use the Air Force to bomb supply lines from the north, and even bomb our allies in the south, trying to prevent advantages to the south, advantages of the communists in South Vietnam. America actually drops more bombs in Vietnam than we used in all of World War II. We develop different weapons like napalm, which is this gelatinous jelly gasoline type incendiary bomb that burns basically everything it touches, and Agent Orange, which is a chemical that's used to deforest trees to get rid of leaves on trees and the canopies in the jungle, so bombers and surveillance could see their enemy better. Vietnam uses tunnel systems, and the Vietnamese use these hit and run tactics in which they don't engage Americans in full scale battle. You can see the tunnel system there. And it limits this direct conflict. It's normally like small scale ambushes, and it's just a miserable war to fight if you're a soldier, because you never know when you're on or when you're off, and so these Americans are going to suffer pretty horrible psychological effects, face booby traps and um, tiger pits in which you have sharpened sticks that you might fall into, or trip wires and things like that. The common people of Vietnam are going to fight against American soldiers, not necessarily because they don't want democracy, but because the Americans are there and they don't understand why. And so Vietnam, at least for the Americans, is going to be the first televised war, in which parents and families can watch the war unfold at their dinner table on a nightly basis. And so these body counts and updates of the war are going to constantly bombard the American public, and the American support for the war is going to diminish rather quickly. In January of 1968, there was a planned ceasefire for the Chinese New Year, called the Tet New Year, and the North Vietnam uses that as a time to launch a surprise attack in every major city, basically at the same time in the South. And the news covers the chaos of the situation. And while Tet actually is a military victory for the American military, the American public begins to wonder if the war is winnable at this point. Like, they've been told by the government that, hey, victory is right around the corner, victory is right around the corner. Well, it doesn't look like that on the news after Tet. And so in January of 1968, Lyndon Johnson chooses not to run for re-election, and the Republican candidate of Richard Nixon wins the election of 1968 with the promise to win the war, or to end the war. And Nixon begins to withdraw troops, begins this process known as Vietnamization, which is this gradual withdrawal of American troops. And we turn over the larger and larger responsibilities of fighting the war to the South Vietnamese Army. Nixon tries to bomb his way into victory, basically bombing the North, even bombs different places like Cambodia and Laos, which are neutral nations, which the Viet Cong and the communists would use to bring supplies into Vietnam. I don't know. In January of 1963, Nixon's successful in ending the war. And by 1975, Vietnam has fallen to communist forces. And so by 1975, it's pretty clear that the United States, well, we failed to meet any of our goals of the war, also failed to prevent the communist threat or the communist governments of Vietnam from spreading. Now, it's kind of a similar situation to China. Does containment fail in Vietnam? It's hard to say. The people of Vietnam seem to want to move towards communism and away from an ineffective, corrupt capitalist democracy or capitalist dictatorship. And then so possibly you can make the argument for that, but at the same time, um, it's the will of the people that's taking over. Okay, and so we'll end there with Nixon and Vietnam, and we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about Nixon and Russia and China with the next video.